I should say also that Form, the organisation that Sharma and I both curate for, is a craft and design-based thought leadership. A lot of our arts and design and craft projects are focused on having some kind of social impact, and they're very much community driven. The projects that Sharma and I are both working on really sort of fall into that area. So first of all, I wanted to show you this little short film which was made by one of our Aboriginal filmmakers, Curtis Taylor, and his mentor, Nicole Marr. And it gives you just a little bit of an overview about what the whole project really is about. Thanks, Cecil. There we go. There we go.
For those in cities and towns as well, and they'll capture another moment of this complex story.
The Intangible project is about community, collaboration and reconciliation. It involves 17 communities across the Pilbara, Midwest, Kimberley and Goldfield regions of Western Australia. Yet I reckon this story is not just for Western Australia, it is for all of us, for communities right across Australia. Aboriginal people telling our story and our history to the world. Our old people teach us about country, law, language, and all the stories that crisscross the dreaming tracks intersected by the Kenningstock Road. "5 years in the making, over 110 of us working on this project. We have learned a lot. It's about two-way learning, black and white, urban and remote, and also Aboriginal to Aboriginal. The Kenningstock Road project had 58 kinds of workshops in country, with young people, old people, with emerging and established artists and art centers. It gave all the different communities spread across the desert a chance to shine. This hasn't ever happened before. The project gave us a chance to listen to each other, work and learn from each other. These works should be accompanied by people. They should have a custodian with them. Someone's got to be interpreting. It is not an exhibition. It is a cultural expression. It is a living piece that has to have the energy of the people with them. All the artists are family for each other. Family means you belong. Wherever you go, you're not lost. This is a story about reconciliation in action. Once it touches your heart, you can't be the same again.
It's another history in the making that I reckon that, will educate the white Australians, not only white Australians, but also Indigenous Australians as well. I'm a saltwater man from the coastline, and learning the inland desert people, how they paint and tell their stories, and how they, get along together. It's just something you have to experience for yourself.
There are so many layers to the Kendall Stockwell project. It is unified, the old people sharing with no shame. This is our history.
Can you try saying the name of the exhibition? That's good, sure.
So they're quite hard names to say. The name of our exhibition is actually Iwaraguju, which means one road, because the story of the whole project is about the Canning Stock Route, which is this very long dirt road that runs through 3 deserts in Western Australia. I'll show you in a second. I'll just open this PowerPoint. It was a road that was surveyed in the early 1900s during a mining boom in Western Australia. And interestingly, we're going through another mining boom now. So to give you a little bit of context about the project, the reason that we wanted to really focus on creating opportunities for Aboriginal artists to tell their stories through art is because art is one area in Australia today where we're kind of succeeding in terms of Aboriginal livelihoods. There are about 22 million Australians, and only 2.6% of Australian population is Indigenous, and we have some of the worst standards of living for Indigenous people in the world, and amongst OECD countries we are rating very low. We have, 28% of Australia's prison populations are Indigenous. We have incredibly high rates of Indigenous infant mortality. There's still a 10-year life expectancy gap for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Indigenous Australians earn half or less of what non-Indigenous Australians earn. They're 3 times more likely to commit suicide than non-Indigenous Australians. And in remote communities, so in Australia, the population hugs the coastline, basically, and it's located in small centres around the country. And the vast sort of stretch of Australia is inhabited mainly by Indigenous people. And there are, in these remote communities, there are virtually no forms of sustainable income other than art centres, which have emerged in the 1970s. Acrylic painting on canvas really began as an art form in the 1970s at Papunya, when a white teacher called Jeffrey Barden went to Papunya community, and he introduced canvas and board and acrylic paint to these desert artists, or who were just desert senior men who'd come in from the desert only in the last sort of 20 years, 10 years maybe, and they started experimenting with the paint and transposing their cultural beliefs and their ways of seeing and their ways of painting traditionally on artefacts or on the sand into paint. And the result were these incredible, mind-blowing cosmological paintings, which were just exquisite. And they're now like global, international treasures, and highly, highly collectible. All of the desert people, I'll show you, I might go forward and go back again. Actually, I should have had a good map right up at the beginning. Most of the family in this Canning Stock Route region are, this is a map, it's quite dark here, but this is Western Australia, you can see divided there. It's more than a third of Australia's landmass, as you can see in the inset map. And you can see a line kind of squiggling in the centre there. That's the Canning Stock Route. So it cuts across a huge swathe of Western Australia, and it cuts across the language groups, the territories of 10 distinct language groups, and it impacts on an area of about 15 to 20 language groups altogether. And all those language groups are distinct cultural groups, but they're all interrelated either culturally or by family. So once the Papunya painters started painting in the 1970s, and Aboriginal people are traditionally nomadic, and as a result of this quite complex history, which I'll give you a little bit more of an overview of in a second, people were sort of dispersed across the desert, but they were still family for people far, far away at the top of the route. The people in the middle were still family for those, across those areas. So the people of Papunya would travel to Balgo, and Papunya is over near that line, and they would travel to the very top of the Canning Stock Route to see their family at Balgo, and then Balgo people started painting with acrylic as well. They were two of the really early art centres. And then Fitzroy Crossing people started painting, and then so it's now taken off. There are these art centres proliferating all over the remote north of Australia. And at the moment, let's go back a little bit. At the moment, the Aboriginal art industry the annual income is about $200 million a year in Australia, which far exceeds the non-Indigenous art market. So in art, so these communities, it really is the only sustainable form of enterprise in these communities. And some of these artists earn really amazing, incomes through it, and they support entire extended families through their practice. Oops, I'm looking at the wrong screen there. So this painting here I just wanted to tell you a little bit about as well. So obviously, on that note, painting is a really important form of economic practice for these artists in remote areas. But it is, for Aboriginal artists, it's so much more than just economic, obviously. And it's I think artists have a different relationship to art than a lot of non-Indigenous artists who have this sort of passionate aesthetic and conceptual approach to their painting. For Aboriginal artists, it really is about maintaining connections to country. So the other interesting thing about the Aboriginal artists in Australia who are most successful is that almost all of them, or a large number, if not the majority, are well over the age of 60. Most of them probably average around 70 years of age, and some up to 90 years of age. And they are often, especially in the Canning Stock Route region, in our project, most of the artists grew up in the desert, completely traditionally, and they first came into contact with non-Indigenous people on the stock route. And in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s and 1970s, they left the desert and came into these communities which were once missions or stations or towns, fringe towns, service towns. And then they, as a result of I'm getting ahead of myself in the history section, but basically people were kind of forced to remain in these towns. There was no income other than welfare. But these old people had a way of seeing which was really shaped by their experiences growing up in the desert. So this painting here was painted by 4 senior artists, ladies, 3 of them sisters, culturally sisters, not actually blood sisters, and one of their daughters-in-law. And this painting's called Kun Kun. It's actually upside down. The kids are doing somersaults in front of it at well 33, which is right in the middle of the Canning Stock Route. But I think this is a really interesting painting to give you a little bit of an idea about the significance of painting for Aboriginal artists, because it's called Kun Kun, and you can see in the very centre of the painting there's this kind of tadpole shape, teardrop shape. That's Kun Kun, and Kun Kun is this very, very important water site, because obviously in the desert, this desert region, I'll show you some photos in a second, water is incredibly scarce. In fact, in that map I showed you a second ago, you can see along the Canning Stock Route there, you've got these little tiny, tiny dots. They're the waters that became the wells on the Canning Stock Route. Those white spots there are bodies of water, but most of them are salt. And you can see the rivers off the coast, but they come nowhere near the Canning Stock Route. So that vast stretch of country in the centre there, water is incredibly precious. So for Aboriginal people, not only do they rely on it for survival, but it's also highly sacred. People have very, very sacred associations with water. and many permanent springs, living springs, are inhabited by beings which are ancestral beings, and it's part of what non-Indigenous people often refer to as mythology, but Aboriginal people definitely don't refer to it as mythology. For them, it's their jukurba, it's their dreaming, like an alternate
Religion.
it's like a religion for them, but it's another level of reality which is parallel to this one. It's still in existence, but it's also the creation time. But at the same time, it's still here in this current reality. It's just at a different level. So people, especially senior artists, senior elders, can slip between those realms. They have a lot of power. So back to this painting, Kun Kun is a site that is very, very, very important, and particularly to women. So in Aboriginal culture, traditionally anthropologists tended to be men, and they had this whole idea that Aboriginal culture was very, very patriarchal, and it was all about men, and men are these important people, and women aren't allowed to be involved, blah, blah, blah. Not true. There are distinct spheres of power in Aboriginal society. Men have their own law, and it is completely restricted to men, although some parts are essential for women to participate in. They can't begin their own law without women, and often they need prompting from senior women to remember what goes on. Some of the old men have told me that they're so completely stuffed without women, basically. But then there are these very secret areas of their law which women cannot come into unless something goes wrong, and then again they need the oldest and most senior and knowledgeable women to come in and save the day, basically. Yeah. Which is, that's another issue. And then you have women's law, which again is, there are public parts of women's law which men are also required to be involved in, and then there's secret women's law. So Kun Kun is part of secret women's law, and it's called, it's part of kangaroo dreaming, and kangaroo dreaming, again, is part of men's law. So it's a really hugely important tract of men's law that relates to initiations. And when young boys are being initiated into men, it's a long process, and they travel through the country. So they go through one ceremony at one place, and they go to another place, and they pick up more people, and they go through another part of the ceremony, and they keep travelling. And it's all through song lines, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. So Kun Kun is one of the sites on that song line, but it's women's law relating to men's law. So the songs that women sing there can't be heard by men, but it's part of men's law. So that's all I can say about the law in relation to this painting. But all the other circles in that painting, there are 72 named water sites in that painting. And the 4 old ladies who painted it grew up in that country, and they travelled all through that country, and they know all the stories and all the law about every single one of those sites. They also have all these personal and historical and domestic stories about all these sites. Who was born at which waterhole, where their grandmother, where their grandfather died, where their mother did such and such. And when they were painting this painting, they had 2 younger women who were helping them, and they were kind of directing them what to do, and they were sort of filling in areas of colour. And while they were painting, these old ladies were transferring these stories to these young women who didn't grow up in their country, who'd never travelled through that area, who hadn't even been to Kun Kun, even though it's quite close, relatively speaking, in this very, very enormously remote and vast area. So these women were learning the stories that way. And then when they finished the painting, this is the day after they finished the painting, 2 days after they finished the painting. So the day after they finished the painting, they rolled it up and they chucked it in the back of a troopy, a 4-wheel drive, and they threw all the old ladies in and all the kids, and they drove out to Kun Kun with all the young women. And when they got there, the boys did a little dance, because it's part of men's law, so the boys can do this little boys dance, and then they had to go away. And then the ladies got the young women, and they sat the young women down, and they put the painting on the ground, and the old women started singing the song for Kun Kun to teach the young women who'd never learned it, and the other old women danced around the canvas to show what it was about. So really profound level of connection that painting has for people, and it's an opportunity for people to remember and to teach and to pass on and to connect, and people get homesick for their country. So painting is a really, really amazing medium. So in a way, again, this is like a map. But it's a schematic map. It's not like a Western map. There are going to be quite a few maps that I'm going to show you here. This is another kind of map which the Burraku people at the very top of the stock route were painting of their country, and it does follow a topographical map. This is just a detail of it. But what they did was they started entering a lot of other information about their country that was significant to them culturally. So you have all the water topography of waters, and sandhills and that sort of thing, but all of these different colours represent different kinds of information, so different kinds of food, different kinds of medicine, different sacred spaces in this country, etc. And this was out of the entire collection of paintings that were painted for the Canning Stockroot project. This painting, these artists would not sell to the National Museum. They said, no, we're keeping this for our children. So it's been borrowed as part of our collection. It's travelling around the country, but when it's finished, it goes back to Parakumop and they keep it for their own communities. There's just a little quote by one of our senior cultural advisors and translators. And again, it kind of just reinforces that, you know, it's about storytelling for Aboriginal artists. It's a way of connecting to the stories of their country. So there's that map again. This is what a lot of the Canning Stockroot actually looks like. It's desert country. It travels through 3 deserts, the Great Sandy, Little Sandy and Gibson deserts. A lot of it is red dirt, but there is vegetation and life. There are also, I think there's something like 310 sandhills that you have to cross, and they're like this. It's an arduous journey along the Canning Stockroot. There's also, as I pointed out to you on that map, the salt water. This is one of the biggest in fact, I'll show you that map again. On that line, you can see there, so that enormous white spot in the middle of that line, that's this, which is Lake Disappointment. And for Aboriginal people, it's one of the most dangerous areas in their realm. And they have a dreaming story associated with this, that there are cannibal beings living underneath the lake. So Aboriginal people will not go near this place voluntarily. But it's interesting because when droving began on the Stockroot, and I'll get to that in a second as well, the history of the use of the Stockroot for its actual purpose, drovers had to pass, Aboriginal drovers had to pass by this area. So they would, those older people who have a great deal of power and knowledge, they would go in front of the droving teams, which are like cowboys with cattle and horses and camels, and they would call up the wind, because the law for this place says that if the wind is blowing, you're safe. If the wind is not blowing, it means that those cannibal beings, the Ngayangalgu, have blocked the wind, and they're invisible. Normal people like us can't see them, but Maban people, those magic elders who have, and not all elders are Maban, Maban people have a very special power, and they can see between worlds, and they can move between those 2 realms very easily, and they can change shape and that sort of thing. They can see these Ngayangalgu. But they will hunt people and they'll drag you underneath the surface of the lake, and they have their own sun and their own moon, and they're very, very scary. So this place Aboriginal people really seriously avoid. There are 3 places on the Stockroot, and the Stockroot's 2,000 kilometres long, where there's large supplies of water. This is one of them, fresh water that is. Mostly, if you can see water on the Canning Stockroot, that's what it looks like, a tiny little surface water. So water was very, very precious. It is very, very precious. So again, here's a better map of the Canning Stockroot, and it shows you, how much of, Australia that route crosses. And now the reason that it was surveyed is because, as I said, there was a mining boom in Western Australia. In the south, at the very southern point of that Stockroot is a place called Wooloona, and it had the biggest gold mine in Australia in 1905. And there were 30,000 miners in Wooloona mining gold, which is a huge number, especially at that time. I mean, even by today's standard, I don't know if we have any mines that big in Australia. And they were rioting because they didn't have enough meat. And Western Australia is extremely arid. I don't know how far I've got until I can show you. Another one's too far down. It's extremely arid. That whole northwest is basically desert country. When you see it from a satellite view, you can see how dry it is. I'll show you in a minute. But all of the state's beef came from the very north of Western Australia, and it was usually transported by ship down to Perth, which you can see at the very bottom of the west of Western Australia there. And most of the cattle came from the West Kimberley, but the East Kimberley cattle, there was large supply of East Kimberley cattle, but they were plagued by tropical ticks. And they had to transport their cattle north to Wyndham, and it had to be quarantined there for 6 months and then shipped down. It made it very, very expensive, and men were rioting in the mining regions. So there was a royal commission was established to discover why beef was so expensive, and they said we need to build a stock route through this desert country to get the cattle down really quick, and because it's so dry, the ticks will fall off and die. And that is actually what happened, which is quite incredible. But there were a lot of complications and unforeseen consequences of that happening. So this is a photo of the team who surveyed the Canning stock route. And the guy in the back row in the centre is Alfred Canning, after whom the stock route is named. And the guy next to him on his right is a bloke called Edward Blake, who became a very infamous man in the Canning stock route history. And he, in this photo, you can see he has not been named. He was so hated by the establishment, the colonial, white establishment, that they refused to name him in this photograph because he accused Alfred Canning of abusing Aboriginal people in the process of surveying the stock route. So when they set off on this trip, they knew they didn't have a lot of time to survey the route. So they needed to locate waters really quickly, and most of those waters, like I showed you, that very small water hole, most of them though you couldn't even see. You just have to know where the water was, and then you have to dig for it. You couldn't see the water on the surface. So Canning set off with a lot of guns and a lot of chains, and when they would find an Aboriginal person, they would run them down on horses and often chain them up and make them lead them to water, basically. And there were a number of incidents which were extremely severe, and Edward Blake thought it was really poor behaviour, and he wrote a number of letters on the return, and he also accused them of abusing Aboriginal women sexually, which they denied. But he wrote a number of letters to the Aboriginal protectors and to government, and everybody ignored him. And then he wrote a letter to the West Australian newspaper, and his letter was published on the front page, and everybody jumped, and they established a royal commission to investigate the treatment of Aboriginal people by Canning's party. Because the stock route was considered so important to the state's economy, they cleared Canning, and they were also already on Canning's side. They thought that Blake was an unreliable witness and that he had a gripe against Trotman, who is the guy at the bottom right who was in charge of handling the natives, and he was a very rough man. His treatment of Aboriginal people was definitely questionable. They were acquitted of all charges, and 5 days later they set off to actually construct the stock route. So, So yeah, they set off with a much bigger team, and there we go. That's why. Okay. And this is one photo of how Aboriginal people were chained in that process of locating water. They set off in 1908 to survey the stock route. This is the team. Now, this is a quote from one of our other senior cultural advisors, Tom Lawford-Purabari, and he was explaining how those wells were established on Aboriginal people's waters, and they took them over, and it prevented Aboriginal people from being able to access their own waters for survival. But it also cut across the songlines, which Curtis mentioned in the film before, and the songlines crisscross the entire country, and they're those law tracks that I was talking about with that Marlu dreaming, that law travels across these lines, which are all songs, and they travel from one group to another. So one group knows a song or sings a song in their language, and it's audio version of topography. Like, it changes the tempo and the sound changes for the different kind of land masses that it's travelling across, and they can travel right across Australia. So this is a photo of another map, and this is a map of the songlines that this old man, Mr. P, drew for us. And this grid, it's a schema of how Aboriginal people see those songlines. So that grid covers in the whole of Australia, and each one of those lines represents a different songline. And the places where they cross over represents a different water, and the area in between those waters, those squares, represent the territories of different people. And those where those crossovers represent where the song changes from one language to another, and how all those groups, they have ties and connections to each other, and there's collaborative relationships because they have to pass on the songs and the laws to each other, so they have to maintain good relationships. he's drawn on this map the Canning stock route as it zigzags across these song lines and interrupted many important places and took over some really important sacred waters. So it really, Aboriginal people do see it that it kind of split the country apart to some extent, and it would split people apart once it came to be used. So this shows you another version of that map, and you can see here how arid this country is. And we've marked in here all of the different language groups that are kind of impacted by the Canning stock route. And obviously those white ones in the centre are the language groups that the stock route directly transects, the territories of language groups it transects. Now, after Alfred Canning mob finished surveying the stock route, the first drovers who came down the stock route in 1911 were murdered by Aboriginal people, were killed by Aboriginal people. It's alleged that was really because of this politics around water, that people didn't have access to their own waters, and these white men were coming and they were aggressive, and who knows really why they were killed. But in Perth, it caused an outrage because this stock route was so important to the economic, livelihood of the state, that they sent this man, you can see him right in the very centre there in the white jumper, called Pilmer, who was infamous all over Western Australia, and all Aboriginal people knew him because he was dangerous and he would just killed so many people. So he set off on, an authorised punitive mission to get the people who killed those drovers. It wasn't a justice mission, it wasn't to bring them and take them to jail, it was just to kill them. He didn't kill them, but he killed about 14 other people. He killed a whole family, including children, and he killed these other people, and nowhere near the place where the drovers were actually killed. As a result of that, and there was some more deaths that resulted, no drover would go down the Canning stock route again. Everyone was terrified. It became known as the most dangerous stock route in the world. So it was basically shut down for the next 20 years. Then mining went through another boom, and the miners were rioting again because beef was so hard to get, and there was another Royal Commission that said we have to open up this stock route, basically, because we need to get meat down to the south very quickly. So they sent this guy called William Snell up the stock route to fix the wells because they'd fallen into disrepair over 20 years. And when he went up the stock route looking at these wells, he said, no bloody wonder there has been so much trouble along the stock route. Aboriginal people can't even get to their own waters. People have drowned in these wells because you saw those waters, those surface waters, people could access them very easily. They could dig to get their own water. When Canning put these wells in, he put them either right on top of or right next to native wells, which leached all the water out of them, and they became these incredibly deep shafted things, which are like 40 feet deep. And the machinery to get them out required a camel to draw water, one bucket of water, or the coordinated efforts of 3 men. The equipment was very dangerous. People were killed or injured, trying to wrestle with those buckets, and they'd hit them on the head. Other people drowned in them. It was an absolute disaster. So William Snell, thank you, getting confused, started building ladders into the wells so that Aboriginal people could get down them and access water. And that really represented a shift in the history of the Canning stock route. So droving then began from 1930 to 1959. It was the most prolific time of the Canning stock route's use. We don't actually have very many photos of droving on the stock route, but basically it involved travelling up to 700 head of cattle, 2,000 kilometres, across land through the desert to Wooloona. And once droving began, Aboriginal people started to be employed as drovers, and they were excellent horsemen and excellent cattlemen. So a lot of Aboriginal people from the north of the stock route became, involved in droving and in stock work, and gained, a lot of pride and self-worth through their involvement in this industry. And they would often come across Aboriginal people, desert people, who they would interact with, and who would often follow the drovers because the drovers were travelling with good food. And as a result of people, their countrymen, following them to these, they would end up in these new places like Wooloona or Billaloona at the top of the stock route, or a range of other places. So eventually Aboriginal people started moving out of the desert. in the late 1950s, there were very few Aboriginal people living still in the desert. This is one group that was discovered by a mining survey in 1957 at Well 40. And these are some of our artists. The man in the very centre of those three men there is Brandy Jungarai, who's actually, he just passed away recently. But he was one of our artists, and this story, you know, for them was like this amazing experience of interacting and coming into contact with white people for the first time. And he tells his brother, Patrick, tells some hilarious stories about first contact and coming, you know, experiencing coffee for the first time when they asked for water, and the Māori word for water is guppy. And when they met the white guy driving this helicopter, they said to him, guppy, because they had no fresh water in this place. And the guy was like, okay, and he went and got him some black coffee, and Patrick was like, what the hell is this stuff? And he said he's never drunk coffee since, it was so disgusting. And they were giving them food, and all this mob were going, this is disgusting, throwing it away. Someone drank oil thinking that it was honey. You know, all these, and one of the white men tried to take a photo of another one of their brothers, and he freaked out and ran away. When the helicopter took off on a survey one day, they were snuck into one of the tents, and one of the men was fiddling around with things and turned a radio on. They thought there was a man in it, and you know, all these really classic things, which they think is hilarious, really, really funny. This is a painting by Patrick Jungarai, who's the brother of that man in the centre there, and this is his story of what eventuated after that picture was taken, because their young brother was very, very sick, nobody knew why, and when the helicopter crew saw him, they offered, none of them could understand each other, but they took him to Balgo for medical attention. But his family were like, yes, take him, but you're going to bring him back, aren't you? And they assumed that the helicopter crew would come back with this young boy who was only 10 years old, and they never did. So everyone was waiting for him, and then they decided, they knew that they'd gone to Balgo, so then Brandy and Patrick walked all the way up the stock route to find him. And when they found him, and this is the story, those white squares represent each of the wells that he travelled to on his way up to Balgo to find his brother, who nobody knows what his real name, nobody remembers what his real name was. He's just known as Helicopter because he was taken away in a helicopter, and he landed in Balgo in a helicopter. No one had ever seen one before. So that's, you know, how he represented that journey. In 1963, another group of our artists, and quite a lot of our artists are in this picture. The two ladies at the far end and three in the middle are all our artists. They were located more in the centre of the stock route. These are some of their paintings from our collection, which is gorgeous. And in 1976, another one of our artists came out of the desert the first time. She's that little girl there with the dingo puppies on the left. She's the same age as me. And her parents actually ran away because they weren't allowed to marry. They were wrong skin to marry. Because in Aboriginal culture, everybody has a skin name which makes them family for everybody else. And you can actually fit everyone in the world into the skin system and work out how you're related to everybody. So everybody in a community is family to you, even though they may not be blood family. So, and there are certain people you're allowed to marry, certain people who are your parents, certain people who are your uncles, your aunts, your grandparents, and anybody who's your uncle or your father-in-law or your brother, you are not allowed to marry at all. And traditionally it was, you know, punishable by death. She, the lady with the big coolamon on her head, she and one of her family relatives, they weren't actually relatives, you know, blood related, they fell in love and they ran away to go back to the desert. Her whole family had come into Wiluna, and then they ran away back to the desert, and they lived out there until 1976. And there was a big drought going on, and some of their family members in Wiluna were worried about them and came out to find them, thinking they were starving. But you can see those red fruits in the top of her coolamon. That whole thing is loaded. It was about 30 kilos of food, so they were actually fine. And sadly, when they came into town, it wasn't a happy story. It had a really tragic end. Both of her parents tried to run away back to the bush 3 times, and their family worried about them and kept bringing them back. But Georgina, the little girl, her father, started drinking. They were very unhappy in town. They weren't connected to their country. It was it was a hard life. There was no employment. People were very poor. There was, you know, stuck in these camps where, you know, fringe camps basically. And her father ended up killing her mother when he was drunk. So it was very sad. So now comes to the story of our project, which is the contemporary telling of this story through art and through oral history, as Rita was saying. So what we did was engage all of these art centres. You can see all the coloured dots there. Those communities where people were dispersed to as a result of the Canning Stock Route history. You know, almost a circle around the stock route, and now there are art centres in each one of those places. And until we started this project, nobody really knew much about, or really realised that all of these artists, the 110 artists involved in our project, that they had anything to do with the Canning Stock Route, because you can see how far away some of those coloured dots are from the stock route. But these artists all came from that country and were painting it, and so we thought that we would get them together and we would get them to tell their stories, and we would kind of paint a picture literally of this Aboriginal history of the stock route, because it's quite famous in Australia, the colonial non-Indigenous version, but the Aboriginal version has not really been known until now. So we took all the artists on a trip along the Canning Stock Route in 2007. There were about 60 artists who came on this trip, and they would come in at their country in different locations, and they painted 120 paintings on the stock route. They were really totally inspired. And we had 3 Aboriginal filmmakers on that trip, and Hayley was our first Aboriginal curator, and she was amazing on that trip. She looked so young there. And we were started recording oral histories on that trip as well. And you can see that old fella, Bidget Tinker. Look how happy he looks having his story recorded. The project was really fantastic in terms of making people feel recognised and acknowledged, you know, for the first time, because nobody's paid any attention to Aboriginal people and their stories. So these are the paintings that were produced on the trip. When we got to the very top of the stock route, we had our first exhibition on the shore of Nyana, which is the lake at Bidduluna. Some of the artists looking at the artwork. And Hayley, we had Wally Caruana, who's on the left there. He was the senior curator of Aboriginal art at the National Gallery of Australia for 20 years. And he was on our project for 2 years, mentoring the team in terms of curating Aboriginal art. And you look at Hayley's face there, you can see how much she was totally engrossed in this process, and she loved being mentored by Wally. It was really fantastic. So this is the whole team. We had 3 Aboriginal curators, 4 Aboriginal filmmakers, and Nicole Ma, who made that film with Curtis at the beginning, is a multimedia producer and mentor. Tim and Carly, their husband and wife, and it was Tim's idea. The whole project was his idea, because he had kind of been working in art centres and started piecing together this story that all these people had a relationship to the stock route. Carly was the original project manager, and Carly, myself, John, and the 4 curators, 3 curators, all curated the show collaboratively. Now, these photos are 2 of our filmmakers, and one of the really important parts of the project has been about transmitting training, knowledge, culture to next generations. And our young crew are really, really passionate about that as well, because they've all had really fantastic, you know, mentors in their own lives, and they're really keen on passing that on. And that's been a huge part of our project, is making sure we're transmitting knowledge and information to the next generation. And Marika is also a photographer, the young girl on the right in the previous spread. And these are 2 of her photos. And some of her photos are actually going to be at the Lullac Colour show that opens on the 1st of November. So it'd be worth coming to see. And her films as well are going to be shown there. So when we started curating the show, we spread out all these paintings and we mapped them out in relation to the stock route, because it seemed the most logical way to do it. And because they're all about places, you could literally map them. So this was a fantastic photo that kind of showed, you know, the country through painting. And we were trying to work out how we were going to curate this in an exhibition, in a physical space. But I love that photo. So the collection, it's a very funny looking 120 there, of artworks that ended up being acquired by the National Museum of Australia was 120. The team of curators curated the 240 original paintings down to 120, and they're the other things, and they range from 45 by 45 centimetres up to big 300 or 3 metre works. then we had a range of objects as well. So carvings, baskets, ceremonial items, and sculptures, etc. We ran 52 workshops on country over the last 6 years, which is absolutely massive feat, incredibly expensive because it's such a remote region. But those workshops have been really, really amazing. This is a photo from one of our workshops, which is up in Fitzroy Crossing. And a lot of what we did on the project, we were really guided and directed by the elders who would say, we want to do this, we need to do this, we need you to help us. So a bunch of the old people said to us, we need to have a workshop that's about, passing on ceremonies, because a lot of the young kids don't know these songs and these dances. So we need you to help us to put on a workshop. So we did. We put on this workshop, and, the old people kind of, knew what they wanted to do. In the daytime, everybody was making artefacts. We brought Clint up, and Clint was filming the whole process. In the evenings, all the young people would dance for the first time, learning all these new ceremonies and songs, and the old people would sing. This was also really one of the most amazing things about that whole workshop, actually, because Kaningara, this is the song and the dance for Kaningara, which is well 48 on the Canning Stock route. And the ceremony for that place hadn't been performed for more than 20 years because the boss for that country had passed away, and he'd passed away before he'd been able to pass it on to anybody else. And in that, when I was talking about the skin system, how everyone's related, and also through law, that law travels from one place, and the people who law travels from here to here, they have a special connection because they have to trade over that law. That old man in the fluorescent yellow shirt, in the dream time, the place that he's the boss of, and Kaningara, this place that dances for, in the dream time, they're best friends. So that old man has a responsibility to protect the law of his best friend in the dream time. So when that other old man, Kaningara man, passed away, he kept the law for that place, and he kept it in his head. So he was the one who said, we need to do this workshop because I need to teach somebody, because he's like 90, I need to teach somebody this before I pass away. So we pulled all these people together, and we got this man here, Bumbler, who is another one of our artists, and he's from Kaningara. So Spider, and look at his face there, he's grinning from ear to ear. He's so happy to be passing this on at last. And he painted Bumbler up, and then Bumbler, we couldn't get a very good photo of him dancing, but you sort of get the spirit of it there. He danced that dance. And then we had another workshop after that, like about 6 months later, where we went back and we got all the old people, and most of them are women. Like I was saying before, women have amazing memories, and they are the knowledge bank for a lot of this stuff. Spider is the only man who knows it, and there are about 10 women who know the song and the law for this place, including the wife of the old man who passed away. And so when we went back and we sat down with all these old people, and we recorded and filmed them singing the whole song cycle so that we could give it to Bumbler and all the other Kaningara young people so they'd know it and they'd be able to, follow it themselves. It turned out this old lady who was the wife of the boss for Kaningara, she knew it better than anyone. She was directing him on how to go, and he was so impressed. He was just like, oh, you're deadly. It was really lovely. So that was a very special outcome, seeing that revived again. People cried when it was performed too. Lots of the old ladies cried because they hadn't heard it for so long. There's some little girls who were performing Manga Manga for the first time. Young boys performing Goodal for the first time. So Goodal is the place that old man who taught the Kaningara man, this is his law. And then there were all these young men who danced Majarka for the first time. And Majarka, unlike those other dances, can only be danced by men. It can't be danced by boys. So this is the first time that all these fellas were dancing this after they'd been initiated. And this dance has actually had a big impact on really kind of getting young people interested in their culture again, young men interested in their culture again, because this is not the full regalia. You saw the photo of Clint filming the group with the big headdresses. That's this dance. They're not fully dressed up, but they're very, very, it's a very strong dance, and all the women cheer when they dance it, and so they feel pretty good when they're dancing it. So as a result, we had so many young men waiting for us to take them out to this workshop. Like, we could barely fit them in the troopy. It's like 25 young men like wanting to come out and kids chasing our truck, trying to jump on. It was really great. So in the daytime, the ladies were teaching young girls how to make coolamans, which are the wooden dishes they used to carry on their heads. And the old people were teaching younger men how to make a range of kali, which is boomerangs that mainly old people use for singing. And these are some of the headdresses and sculptures, and that's the contemporary in the photos, sort of the quick version using wool to make that headdress, but traditionally it's made using ochre and bark and emu feathers and this fluff that's like bush cotton. And then we had other workshops where the ladies made baskets, which aren't traditionally, they're not made traditionally by Aboriginal people, but they've become something that ladies really love to make in Maru country. This was a workshop at Coonawarrigi at Well 33 when they were making these baskets. But the ladies, and I love this photo. Marika also took this photo. The reason they're wearing the baskets on their head is because for these artists, they say they didn't make these baskets traditionally, but they did make these coolamans made out of wood, and they would carry all their food, water, etc. on their heads in these wooden dishes. So they say baskets for us are like these nguri, these piti dishes. But they also use some of the technology. So you can see the wooden dishes up the top there. At the bottom left, you can see these kind of bird nest shapes, and they're called mangori, and they're the head pads that they would rest those wooden dishes on. And they say making baskets is like making mangori, but it's also like making bush sandals, which are on the right there. And that's how they used to make sandals. So it's kind of an innovation and a mixture, a repurposing of traditional technologies. So once we had collected all this work, and we also, I should mention, we recorded 250 oral histories with all of the artists and contributors involved in the project. And once we had all those, we translated them we had a team of about 12 translators. We translated about 100 of those oral histories. And then we went back to all the communities again and we checked all of that content with contributors and we showed them what we'd put together. And they kind of directed us and said what they were happy to do and what they wanted to be used and what they didn't want to be used. And then we've been having these curatorial meetings where we started putting together the exhibition, and then we went back again. The photo on the right shows Hayley showing some of the artists the layout of the exhibition and how the paintings were going to sit together, because we wanted to make sure that, culturally it would be all right for certain places to go together and the way we were telling those stories was all right. So we travelled around to all of our communities and showed them the layout of the exhibition and made sure that everyone felt really happy with it. Here's a photo of Curtis in the centre there with the headband, and Nola on the left is our senior Māori translator and cultural advisor, and they're explaining to two of the older artists what we're doing and how we've done it and what it looks like. And you can see in Kanu's face there in the middle, she looks pretty pleased with the way they've been doing it. So then this resulted in the exhibition, which this is the beginning of the exhibition. It was actually the cultural backdrop of Chogum last year, which was a really interesting experience for us because there were a lot of people from other colonial countries who came to see it. These were the wives of the prime ministers and presidents who our crew took through the exhibition, which was a real highlight. But we discovered, lots of people in, places like in Africa, Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, lots of places people were like, wow, this is the same history as ours. We have such similar cultures, we have such similar histories, and this is the way we would love to be able to tell our stories. So we thought, okay, this is something that we've always felt we wanted to do as well. It's been so successful, it's brought so many benefits to our artists, and it's had such an impact on Australian audiences, which has been really exciting. Like, it's broken through to a lot of non-Indigenous people who really didn't know anything before. So we thought, okay, we'd like to do something with this. This is Tom drawing that sand map of the songlines that I was telling you about before. This is the part of a few of these photos now to show you kind of the layout of the exhibition. And so we curated it basically geographically. So when you walk through the doorway at the beginning, you're walking in at the south of the stock route and you literally travel through the country, through the paintings. And each area was a geographic area, but it also coincided with a really strong theme that we wanted to explore, whether that was about history or family connections, water, spiritual connections to land, dancing, different cultural groups who are associated with different places and their connections with each other. So this comes to, am I talking? I'm not finished now. So now we come to where we kind of are now with it. I'm going to show you at the end of this another little film of this interaction this little girl is playing with here, which was called One Road. Basically, when we put together the exhibition, it's 900 square metres. It's a massive exhibition. There's only like 3 venues in Australia that are big enough to take it. But even so, and every single painting we had 5 labels or 6 labels of information. So we had like the artist's photo, their biography, the story of the painting, a diagram and a map for every single painting. So a lot of information. But even so, and we had panels and we had like 10 video screens in the exhibition with films that had been made by our crew. So much information, but even so, it only just scraped the surface of the content that we had. It's so much rich content, there was so much information we couldn't fit on the walls. And we were thinking, how are we going to do this? How do we give people a sense of the richness of this country and of these cultures? Because there is such a stereotype in Australia, such a, prejudice of non-Indigenous people about, what Aboriginal people's lives and cultures and country is actually like. So what we did, this is a detail which you can't see very well of Alfred Canning's original map, which is 6 metres long in itself, and it's beautifully, beautifully drawn. And it's basically just a ribbon of the wells that he surveyed along that paper, which for us it was like, this is such a good symbol of how white people see Aboriginal country. It's like, there's nothing there except what we value, the resources that are important to us economically, which were the wells. So we thought, okay, what if we use this as an interface for an interactive where we embed all the other stuff that we know relates to this country geographically. So you'll be able to touch this screen and you'll be able to see films and stories and diagrams and videos and interactive maps and all kinds of things. You'll see it in the video in a second. When the exhibition each time the exhibition has opened in Canberra and Perth, we brought down about 60 artists to see the exhibition, which is a big deal as well and very expensive to do that. And it's great that we could bring them, but there are 250 Aboriginal people involved in the project and only 60 of them have seen the result of their contributions. So what we're doing now is we're migrating the content and the experience of this interactive into a mobile platform for mobile phones and for iPads and also for a web browser, because most of these communities will only have web access to the content. And for us, also from the very beginning of the project, repatriating everything that we've created has been one of the most crucial outcomes of the project for us. So this became a really exciting way. Also, we thought to generate some funding to be able to do it, because everybody loved this. This won an international award in America for museum interpretive display. So we thought, this is a great way to bring back to communities the experience of the exhibition so that young people can play with it, old people can, you can see here, everyone playing with that is an older person. We thought kids would love it, but everyone just loved it. So taking that back, in those forms, this One Road Interactive will also become a portal to the bigger repository. So we're building an online digital repository of content which will contain every single thing we've ever generated, produced, curated, recorded, etc. Which includes all of this, hundreds of hours of footage, 18 short films by the young crew, 140 by Nikki Ma, 250 oral histories, all that stuff, 20,000 digital images, so much stuff. The thing with repatriation in Australia, the model that we're sort of working on, is that Aboriginal people are amongst the most researched people in the world, Australian Aboriginal people, but most people who come in and gather research take it away and deposit it in faraway institutions where Aboriginal people have no way of accessing it. So it creates this vacuum in communities where the transmission of cultural knowledge is further interrupted. It's already been disrupted because people being plonked into these sedentary communities and being forced to participate in the education and employment system or whatever, which is really important for Aboriginal people today, but it's prevented the traditional education system from from taking place, basically, which was on a day-to-day basis, instruction from old people to young people as they're walking through their country. So the removal of that knowledge has really impacted on the transmission of knowledge in communities. So what we wanted to do was create a way of bringing that back to communities, but also of it being really engaging so that young people want to use it. Because when repatriation of content does happen occasionally in Australia, it's usually in data form because there's no other way currently to return material. And young people aren't interested in paper. Young Aboriginal people reading, and the other thing is that education standards are the poorest for remote Indigenous students than anywhere else in Australia by far. So we thought that we would try and create this this way for young people to engage with the content, which is really exciting, and it's touch friendly, and they can use it as they want, and they can control it as well. So we've also been working on pioneering a framework of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protocols and legal frameworks, because in Australia, and I'm not sure actually for the rest of the world, but ICIP, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, is not enshrined or protected in Australian law. So a lot of government agencies who are funding Aboriginal projects insist that groups who are working with Indigenous people follow certain protocols, and if they don't, they won't fund you. But apart from that, there's nothing in law that protects Aboriginal people's Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights like intellectual property is protected instantly in Australia. So we wanted, and under our law, Australian law, everything we've created in the Canning Stockrick project is our copyright. It's not Aboriginal people's copyright, it's ours, because we recorded it. We made this intangible cultural heritage physical, which is ridiculous because it's not ours, it doesn't belong to us. It's the knowledge of the Aboriginal people and their communities that it belongs to. So what this framework that we're developing now actually gives back ownership of everything, all of that ICIP, to the contributors and to their art centres. So they license their knowledge to the art centres, and the art centres will license us use of their material to repatriate the content back to communities and to make this mobile app and any other projects that we all agree are really good to go forward with. So that's also something that's really quite exciting. It will become a model for other groups to use and employ and adapt for their own purposes. And we've been really lucky because we've got the Arts Law Centre of Australia working with us to, create this fantastic framework, which is really awesome. And we've sort of been workshopping it with one of our biggest art centre, and we're going to head back out to all the other art centres in March to kind of, finalise all those agreements. But that's something we're really pleased with. And there's another quote from Tom, which I just think is really beautiful and really summarises the reason why we're doing this. Because, it's like what Curtis said, having this knowledge means that you're not lost, basically. So that's pretty much the last slide. And now I'll show you the film, which shows you what this interactive looks like and what the mobile app and web version will hopefully be exactly like. It's actually, we're just about to start development of it now. Thanks, Cecil.
I have to say that while I said no questions, this is amazing work. You know, I was for 3 years an examiner on the ICH list, and we studied best practices. And having seen so many programs and projects, this is remarkable. You have to write out a methodology.
Yes.
And we have to ask you, did it grow organically, or did you conceive it 6 years ago?
I meant to say that actually.
Yeah.
When we first started.
But did you imagine all this?
No. When we started, it was going to be an exhibition of 30 artists, and it was going to be a year-long project. Thank you, sorry. So yeah, it was going to be a small exhibition, like in a room this big or something, with 30 artists, and we really thought we were going to have it done in a year, and we're going to do a book as well, and we're going to do some films, and yeah, but it just kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and that's one of the great successes of it, is that it has been really responsive. If people said to us, we want to do this, we'd say, okay, we'll work out how we can do that. And so it just kept growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. Yeah, we're actually in trouble with one of our funding bodies because we got money to repatriate the content back in 2009, and Carly and myself, we've been the main project managers on the project since 2007. She started in 2006 and she's now left. She and I have both been like, because it's been a hard slog too. It's been a bit hard project, but an amazing one. We've both been like, yeah, we've got to finish it, we're going to move on. And so we thought we were going to be able to repatriate the content in 2009, but it kept growing. And now we're in trouble because we didn't finish repatriating the project. We have to explain why we didn't do it then. But hopefully they will be pleased when they see the result.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's really, truly a best practice. Because, when you look at indigenous communities anywhere in the world, all the issues, transmission, taking of knowledge away, giving of status, of respect. I mean, you've taken care of all the things and including this. It's amazing. Hats off to you. Well,
Thank you. It was a big team of us.
Yeah,
big team,
that's
yes.
amazing. So the floor is open. I'm sure lots of people want to ask questions. So, Sharmila, though we thought we'd...
At the end?
Should we do it at the end?
Okay,
I'll
fine.
just be very, very brief.
Fine.
I'll be very, very quick, like 10 minutes. I'll just stop on this.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, we'll just swap. Let me just load the... So, I'm going to have to get it off the hard drive. Is there any way that I can...
Control and the minus. Something you might be able to make it smaller. And just go there.
What do you think?
Do pages by and fit window.
Okay.
So you can do that. Pages by then. 2 down.
Okay,
And
yep.
now
So I'll just briefly walk you through this, which is a project that has really followed on and been inspired by the Canning Stock Group. And I think what is interesting about it and what is testament to the fact that Indigenous people feel very empowered by what's happened with the Canning Stock Group is that Form was approached by an organisation called Yamatji Mulpra Aboriginal Corporation, which represents about 18 different language groups across the Pilbara and the Gascoyne, which I'll just scroll down and show you where that is in Western Australia if I can. So where the kind of black marking is that territory. And so we were approached by one of their senior managers who is an Indigenous person. He's a Nyamal man from the South Pilbara. And he said that he'd seen the Canning Stock Group project and was very, very keen to do something in the region where he's from, which could also in a similar way tell the stories of the Indigenous people who are living there. But not only tell the stories, also unite people who kind of live in this region who have been very, very fractured by native title, which I should backtrack a little bit. So in the Australian kind of legal system and in our constitution, Australia is seen as terra nullius, which means empty land. And so when the British came to Australia, they said that this land is essentially uninhabited, despite the fact that obviously Aboriginal people had lived in Australia for 40,000 years. But because they had a different system of land ownership, as Monique mentioned, you know, that the landscape is seen as a space that is sacred, is temporal, is owned by the community rather than individuals. They weren't recognised as having ownership. And these kind of projects like the Canning Stock Route, I think, demonstrate to non-Indigenous audiences in Australia that the people are very, very much... that they have a connection to land, which in a sense is ownership, but it's not in the formal way that we, non-Indigenous people, recognise land and country. So it's a way of saying that, I belong to this place, and because I belong to this place, I care for it. And you know, I think in the Canning Stock Route, obviously the kind of water is very, very precious, just as it is in this particular area of the Pilbara. So thinking about how we tell the stories of people from this region, we looked at the river systems which run through the Pilbara. And the rivers start at the Indian Ocean and they go all the way inland. So they basically run through 10 to 12 different Indigenous language groups in a similar way to the Canning Stock Route. But unlike the Canning Stock Route, the river systems are a shared natural resource. They're very, very, very precious to Aboriginal people. Obviously, in a land where there's very little water, which is very arid, water is very precious, and it's the embodiment of the sacred realm also. So with Yamatji Marlpa Aboriginal Corporation, we conceptualise this project, which is about telling the story of the river. So the river essentially is a map which will be used to trace not only the kind of sacred level which exists beneath the river system and goes into Aboriginal mythology and law. And when we refer to Aboriginal law, it's not L-O-R-E, it's law, it's L-A-W. It's the thing that governs everything from your behaviour in society to the way that you treat the country to the kind of religious realm, which is, and for Aboriginal people, the land is their religion essentially. It's the giver of life, it can take it away, it's a destructive force, it's a creative force. It can be nurturing, but equally it can be very dangerous. And all of the kind of law stories, because it wasn't a written culture, have been expressed orally. So oral expressions, storytelling, performing arts, artwork have all been very, very important expressions. And in this particular region of Western Australia, unlike where the Canning Stock Route is, there really hasn't been the movement towards painting on acrylic. So the people in this region, to pass on culture, really rely a lot on oral histories, storytelling and song, and as Mon said, song lines, some of which are sacred and can only be heard by initiated men, and others which are like poems which are told of everyday life, so anyone can access them. And they were part of entertainment, they were part of people's kind of community connections. What's happened, and one of the reasons that this particular region of Western Australia is in real danger of losing a lot of its oral expressions, is it is the wealthiest part of Australia really at the moment. It's where it's driving our economy with the mining of resources, especially iron ore. So in that sense, it's kind of very, very, it's in need of urgent safeguarding. And because it's always had mining interests, it's also a place where Indigenous culture has really been marginalised. So there hasn't been a lot of kind of cultural projects that have been done in this area. Whilst people have recorded their stories to prove their native title and connection to the land, a lot of it's kind of locked up, like Monique was saying, in archives and museums. So this project is basically about providing a platform for Aboriginal people to access that knowledge, but at the same time, as with the Canning Stock Route project, and based on that model, enabling people to tell their own history, using the river as the kind of the conduit for that. So we would start at the Indian Ocean and run all the way inland, and along the way to ask people to tell stories of culture, but also of modern history. So Aboriginal history has also been very marginalised, as Monique was talking about. So this is also a way to say, Aboriginal people have worked as stockmen, they've worked in the mining sector, they've made a great contribution also to the modern economy of Australia, and that is a history that is largely untold. This region in particular had a lot of pastoral stations, and up until 1967, Aboriginal people were not paid wages on those cattle stations. They were essentially given rations, so flour, sugar, water, boots, clothing. And in 1967, which was the year that Aboriginal people were officially recognised as citizens of Australia, before that they were classified as flora and fauna, they then gained equal rights, basically, and equal wages. So the idea is that the river systems can tell all of those stories, all of those kind of layers of history and spirituality as well. So I think that this is a very poignant quote that came from Waimak, which is that country is our mother, our provider and keeper of our cultural belongings. Culture and country go together. You can't have one without the other. So in that sense, the river as a physical kind of manifestation of country can tell the past, the present and the future stories. So I think one of the things that is very important about the methodology of the Canning Stockroad and about this project is that the governance structure is basically driven by Aboriginal people. So they decide on the content that they want to collect, they decide on the way it's filmed, the way they're represented. And then how it's presented and promoted to the wider audience. And that's very important because of the fact that a lot of Aboriginal knowledge is sacred, so cultural protocols become very important because a lot of information is sensitive. So there are lots of complexities to dealing with how this content is treated, what's represented, how it's displayed. So in this project, like in the Canning Stockroad, we would set up a committee of elders who would advise us on what content is allowed to be collected and how it's represented, and also have cultural advisors. So the outcome of this project, and unlike the Canning Stockroad, because Peter, who has approached us about doing this, has already seen what remarkable outcomes you can have, we've already kind of anticipated what the outcome could be of collecting this content. And like I mentioned before, artwork is not a huge part of the kind of cultural practice in this particular region. So our focus is more on multimedia, so capacity building so that people can learn to make their own films, photograph, and generate their own content for a website, which would become like an open source platform for loading that information. So not only are you representing or telling stories online and giving people a voice, you're also teaching them how to continue to develop those mediums over the long term. Basically capacity building and developing new skills. So one of the kind of platforms that's emerged now, which is very accessible, is Google Earth. I don't think I'm going to be able to show you that, but I'm happy to send a link out. And this is a kind of a screenshot of a Google Earth map that's been done in the east coast of Australia, which shows, you can basically scroll over any area and an image will pop up which tells you a particular story about that place from an Aboriginal perspective, whether it's a modern history or whether it's something that is in the kind of sacred Dreamtime realm. So our project, we developed films, audio recordings and photographs, which would then go online so that people can go online and access this information content wherever they are. So the idea is also to show that whilst, for the kind of British, the country might have appeared empty, for Aboriginal people it's full of meaning, it's full of histories, it's full of stories. And that in a way is also demonstrating the need to protect a lot of the country that's now being kind of interrupted by mining. So in the sense, I think that the Canning Stockroad as a model, like Rita was saying, really represented a kind of best practice and groundbreaking way for telling and dealing with intangible cultural heritage, and curating it in a platform that's very accessible, that people can relate to, that they can understand. And I think that, I've had a lot of people who've had very emotional reactions to the Canning Stock Route exhibition, that they have never seen this history displayed before or represented. And there's something very powerful about someone being able to stand in front of someone who's a mother or grandmother and relate to their story, and maybe they're the same age as them, and had no idea that this was a history that was going on in parallel to their own growing up in Australia. So the Rivers Project, we hope, in a similar way, to be able to give a presence to people living in a different part of Australia and to tell their stories from their own perspective.
Well done. Because, the first sign of success really is an acceptance, is the fact that they are coming back, people are coming back to you to say, do it for us too.
Yeah.
And you haven't yet finished your project. Like you said, you haven't had time to introspect yet. And yet there is. But there is one thing I was wondering if you had thought of. I'd come across a case in Peru where the indigenous people there, through their songs, establish their title to the land. And it ran into a lot of issues because, again, the land that they were on was very rich for both mines and for water. And the waters were going to be dammed. And they sat down and they said, no, but our songs are associated with this land, and our rituals are associated with the way the moonlight falls on a particular mountain. And they had a lot of backing internationally, but it was because of mining, because of economic interests.
Interestingly enough,
So
one of the for this particular project, because it runs through some of the richest land in Australia, one of the funding bodies that we approached did say to us that this project does pose some risk for us, that the whole river might be declared an Aboriginal site. So there is recognition in Australia that certain places are important and sacred to Aboriginal people, but you can go in and you can destroy them and you can pay a fine, basically. There's nothing punishable by jail, or the consequences are not.
Unless you have native title, which Shamla mentioned before, which is the system so native title is the means by which Aboriginal people gain title over their land, and it's not as strong a form of title as freehold. But the way that you have to prove that in court, and today, certainly in Western Australia and the Northwestern Australia where the Canning Stock Route is, every single group except Walloona has been, their native title has been recognised over the land. Everybody has such strong ties to their country that they can prove, but the courts make Aboriginal people prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that their culture is completely intact, which is very unfair for people who've lost, aspects of their culture. But songs, certainly people have to prove that they have all of the songs for their country, they still maintain all their law, that they still put their children through, that they know all the named sites in their entire country, that they can travel through basically on foot if they had to. They have to prove all of this. But people have been so successful, they know their old people know their country. Young people don't, because they haven't grown up there, which is why these projects are so important, to pass that on so those old people don't pass away with it.
I mean, a lot of the native title cases take 10 to 12 years.
Yeah.
And so much information is given that it's taken away and locked away. And so...
Even by land councils. Land councils don't... They are the bodies of Aboriginal people, but they have to hold back a lot of Aboriginal people's knowledge because it could be politically or legally problematic if it gets out. And yeah, it's interesting.
Any questions? While we sit here and we are all ladies and we are all dressed the way we are, and none of us are legal brains, but yet what we are dabbling with is highly dangerous things that actually cause wars and deaths, because that's what they say about culture, that while it appears to be a soft subject, it isn't. The minute it becomes interdisciplinary, it involves land, human beings, people, rights, and rights of people which have been denied, because culture is their repository and this is their only thing.
Absolutely. I think another important element of the Canning Stock Group was that a lot of and people were encouraged to speak in language, so that languages, Aboriginal languages, are highly endangered. In one of the communities that I spent some time, there's only 5 people who still speak that language, and they've been dominated by another language group, and there's only 1,000 people who speak that language. That's due to a lot of factors, but Australia the government also had a policy up until the 70s
1971.
where Aboriginal people
Was
were
illegal.
punished for speaking. They weren't allowed to speak their language. So in that sense, culture, like Rita is saying, has been very contested. It's got a lot of power to it. So these projects are essentially also very political projects.
Very political projects.
Yeah.
And the other thing, sorry, Rita, what I just wanted to touch on, and coming back to the Rivers project, and with our project, like I was saying, most of the artists, the painters who are involved in our project are over 70. And the reason they're such amazing painters, I think, is because they have this different way of seeing the world, the way they've grown up, the cultural environment and the landscape and all of that. It's just a different way of seeing. People who have grown up in the cities, and a lot of the groups that Shamla will be working with in the Rivers project, they've grown up in contact with white people, so they've got feet in both worlds, and they don't see in the same way. And it's the same with the young people in our project. They can't paint like the old people. Like, their painting is much more controlled, doesn't have the same rawness and just like you're entering into a different space. But media is their media. You know, they still speak their languages, they still practice their law, they follow their old people. They're amazing, they have so much knowledge, and their films kind of show that same really amazing worldview that the old people's paintings do. But media is really, and they're all, you know, even though they're, you know, first generation born in hospitals and in communities, they've all got devices and they make films on their phones, and they, you know, they're just really, really savvy. So it's definitely the way forward.
Yeah, so technology has opened up so many new
I think that is
possibilities
the wonder
for
about
recording.
technology.
Yes.
To see that exhibition, to be able to touch it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Gulshanji will be able to tell us, I think what you said about the older people knowing more.
Yes.
And their art being
To ask you one question. All these paintings that you are exhibiting, will they be maintained and kept in a museum with the
Yes.
stories behind them?
Yes. So they were
Okay.
acquired by the National Museum of Australia.
Okay, they're going to be acquired by the National Museum. Then what happens to the younger generation that is now doing the paintings? Will there be a commercial angle to it? Will they be sold in the marketplace?
Yes.
Because I'm sure if people see them in the National Museum, they would want reproductions to take back with them.
Yes, well, that's actually something we're wanting to do through the app, connecting users of the app with the art centre so they can buy work directly from the art centres. They could also download, you know, off of their phone pictures of the paintings, you know, that will return revenue back to art centres. As I was saying,
So far, you have not sold any of them.
oh yes, we've raised $1.4 million in direct and indirect returns to art centres.
Then what you have sold, are they replicas of the
No,
original?
we sold the works. So the entire collection of 120 paintings, 29 baskets, a range of cultural materials were sold to the National Museum of Australia for They got
And
for a
how
bargain.
much of the money has gone back to the
100%.
painters?
100%. Yeah. To the art centres. So the model for art centres, and art centres are an interesting
Yeah, that's
model.
very creditable because nobody does that.
Well, yeah, I meant to mention that as well. We have there are many purposes of our project. One of them is to kind of, you know, record the Aboriginal history of the stock route, to kind of raise the profile of Aboriginal people and culture, to create new markets and new opportunities for art centre communities to create, you know, income, because as I said, they're the only form of sustainable enterprise and income in those communities. And the other thing is that, as I was saying, art is incredibly successful. Aboriginal art is incredibly popular and successful in Australia, and as a result, we are constantly seeking funding. Oh my God, I had a deadline. I was up until
I'm
5
sure
o'clock.
you're
I
always
was up
running
until-
around with a
Yes,
begging bowl.
We are begging. I was up till 4:45 a.m. this morning working on a funding application
That's
for
what
this
it is. I was
repatriation
wondering where the
project.
money is coming from.
Yes, we are constantly begging and
range
run
of different sources.
many. Mining, interestingly, BHP Billiton have been our biggest funder. not our only one. Our project is worth, including this repatriation project, if we get it up, it'll be worth $5 million all up over 6 years.
Okay, when will you be in a point to be able to
Have a
sell it
holiday.
to the common man?
Well, it already... Well,
Right now, you've
May.
sold everything to the National Museum.
No, they own, the museum owns the collection, yes, they own it. They own the collection of artworks and documentary material. So the exhibition, they own. They own the paintings. It's now touring around Australia and it's free wherever it goes. Anybody, except for Sydney, they made people pay. But everywhere else, it's been free for people to see. When it finishes touring, it'll go into storage at the National Museum of Australia, which is also why for us this Digital Futures project is so important, because museum were fantastic. We're very, very grateful that they bought the collection and they've been wonderful to work with, but it should be permanently available
And
to people.
how will the younger generation learn all the stories and be able to
Yes.
relate to
Okay, so-
their children and
Yes.
grandchildren?
So
because
bas-
that is the problem we are having
Yes,
here.
absolutely.
That the older people are going away with all
That's
the
right.
knowledge
That's
that
exactly
they
right.
have.
That's why we wanted to create this, like that interactive that you saw.
And you are
Young
just
people love
talking
that.
of paintings. I am talking of something like
Yes.
200 crafts,
Yes.
which are just going to disappear.
Yeah.
I think
Because
that's
the
what-
older people are not there anymore.
I think that's what's interesting, as Monique was saying, about new technologies, because that's actually what excites people. Like young children anywhere in the world,
They like to play with
there
them.
are certain forms of expression which are almost redundant because they're not relevant to those people anymore. Whereas, Facebook, social media, mobile phones, not only have they opened up the kind of ways that people can record their own culture and see themselves represented on websites and online in an online format, but it's also an exciting thing for them to engage with. So in that sense, I think both of the projects are kind of looking at how do you kind of break that, give access to Aboriginal people
I have had children asking me now, why is Ravan burnt as an evil? He was not an evil. So those are the kind of doubts that keep coming in people's minds,
yeah.
particularly the younger children, because it's technology that probably guides them to say, okay.
That's right. It's a double-edged sword. Technology is interrupting a lot of cultural transmission and practice, but it also has the potential to connect people back with it. And for our project, we wanted to make culture look exciting and sexy. For those young people, like, no, I'd rather go and listen to hip-hop and I'd rather watch, music videos on TV. That stuff's boring. And a lot of young people, kids, they think that, And then when they see it, like I was saying...
Particularly when they cross their
Yes.
11 and 12 years.
Yes, that's right.
Till then they are okay.
That's right.
Manage them.
But what's so interesting is that a project that's connected to the Rivers project, which I can't show you here because it's a men's project and it's considered information that can't be accessible, but that project has been a filmmaking project involving about 20 men, and who've all been, there's a professional filmmaker, but all of these guys have come with their mobile phones and cameras. And so when I was visiting a place which was maybe 8 hours from where this has been happening, the people in that community had seen all of this content because it had been sent to them on their mobile phones. So it's a very, because it's so open source, it's a way that you can share and replicate.
Pass it on.
I think
And create a
technology
buzz.
is, if you can access it in the way you want it, no longer from your grandmother or your mother, but in a way that you are used to accessing information, and it's about your own culture, and it's respectful, and it is viewed by everybody. I think it'll inculcate pride, it'll improve transmission, but it has to be used well.
Yeah, definitely. And even it makes people, when people think that it looks good and it looks exciting and it looks kind of has cachet, more people want to do it. Like I was saying with the young men who were dancing, they had really moved away from their culture and they weren't really wanting to do law and there was nothing. And then that workshop that we did, when those young men all learned to dance that dance for the first time, Tom, who's our cultural advisor, said that had a massive impact on communities. Now every young guy wants to dance that dance, and they have to go through law to be able to dance it. And every single ceremony, every time communities come together, lots of young men turn up for that, which is it's just making things, it's like marketing in a way. Marketing, traditional
Making it
crafts and traditional
fashionable,
cultural practices.
making it something you want.
Yes, making it something you want. And the thing is that it is so desirable, but you just have to connect them to see why it's relevant to young people.
I think that's right. And I think it's also, a bit of a perception problem that that's traditional. And because that's traditional, it's in the past. Whereas actually kind of, conflating this idea of contemporary and traditional into...
You have to give a lot of rationale to the past for the present to accept it. And how you give that rationale is not easy.
Yeah.
Because everything has to have a reason, and everything has to have a logic, and everything has to have why you say it like this.
And I think
So
maintaining
that rationale
integrity.
is very important.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, go.
Sorry, there's a question.
I have two questions. One's related to content.
If you come up, speak it to the mic. There's a slide.
So
Introduce yourself.
my name is Natasha Nanji. I'm the festival director of Unbox Festival, which is an initiative by Quicksand Design Studio and Co-Design, based in Delhi. So we share many of the concerns that have been brought up today. So I've connected to Sharmila and Monique through a colleague of mine. So two questions I had. One is about access to the content. So sort of similarly raised. And one is how many other Aboriginal communities around the country had access to the content?
At the moment, we're still in the process of building this digital repository. There are 17 remote communities that are involved in our project, so they're our main priority. Even the museum doesn't have this documentary material, and they're very, very angry with us. Well, not angry, that's a bit... They're a bit pissed off with us that we haven't given it to them. And I'm like, well, hold your horses, because, our contributors, our communities don't have this stuff yet, and they're our priority. They get it first. So when we build the repository, they're the communities who will have immediate access. But the way we're building this digital repository, we're putting it through an Indigenous cultural protocols-based content management system called Muguru, which allows the communities that we work with to culturally manage their own content, which means that they can restrict access on anything that's sensitive or culturally, meant to be held back for women or men, or, shouldn't be seen by children. And everything, because our project, the purpose of it was to be public, to promote and present Aboriginal cultures to non-Indigenous audiences, as well as preserving it for communities. Most of the content in our archive is for public use. So it will be seen by every community in Australia, and overseas. Once the archive is actually up and it's online, and we've actually content managed everything, and all the communities are clear with the protocols surrounding their own content, it's online for everybody. So it becomes something that, again, it creates a buzz that more people kind of use it and see it and connect with it, that generates pride in those communities and makes young people want to explore it. The other thing is that we're returning the content physically, the digital content physically, to those communities, so that young people can make new films out of the content, and they can make revenue from those films. The Arts Centre communities, they can sell the content that belongs to them from our project to others who want to, make books or exhibitions or films, whatever, and generate revenue that way back to the art centres. So everyone will have access.
And then the other question is a bit more general, so it might be too broad for this for here, but it's about curriculums, school curriculums, and how information, this kind of information is embedded into public school curriculums, because I guess. I just don't know what the access levels are on a kind of amongst the white populations and Aboriginal populations.
So that's a really good question. That was another thing that I forgot to mention in the talk. Because this repatriation project is so expensive for us, it's $1 million project, over $1 million it's going to cost us. We wanted to create as much value through it as possible. So one of the things that we wanted to do is to embed educational content into, especially the app, because that will be, and the app is also computer online, the students and young people and communities will be able to use most. Because the communities have so much identification with the content, it seems crazy not to really gear them towards educational material that will help to raise educational standards, because they are so bad in remote Indigenous communities, so far below national standards. But we also want to create dependent on funding, if we can raise the funding to do it, curriculum-based content for, in Australia there's a national curriculum and there are specific content being taught to specific year levels. Indigenous issues are now a part of the curriculum, national curriculum, which is really good. When I went to school, we didn't learn anything. And that, from our exhibition, so many people, we had thousands of comments from the exhibition when it came back to Perth, and so many of them were from people saying, I knew nothing about this. We were never taught anything about this history, and it's terrible. I'm so glad my children will learn something now. But yeah, at the moment, only years 4, 8 and 10 deal with content that relates to Indigenous culture and history. So if we get the funding, we'll employ an educational consultant to develop content to go into the curriculum. Because the other thing is that, and the reason our exhibition has been so popular, I think, as well, with a lot of those people who didn't know that history and sometimes may have a bit of prejudice or, you know, whatever, is that it's told in such an open way, and it's told by Aboriginal people. It's in Aboriginal voices. When you're watching the films, you're watching Aboriginal people speak to you. You're reading the stories in the voices of Aboriginal people. And people feel like they're being communicated with, and that they have the first time, because a lot of people, they've never even met an Aboriginal person or had a genuine conversation with an Aboriginal person. And when they listen, and they feel like they have this prejudice, this belief that Aboriginal people are like, oh, you ruined our lives, and oh, you came and took our land and we hate you, kind of thing. And they see these people telling the story, you know, really honestly about what happened, but also, yeah, Aboriginal people are so generous, you know, it's amazing. So in the curriculum, I don't think there's any content that actually, you know, what we've done in Australia is, you know, white people telling, you know, being experts on Aboriginal culture and telling the stories for Aboriginal people. So this presents an opportunity for us to provide content to schools where Aboriginal people can tell it themselves.
I would have a question. I'm Amrita from NIFT, National Institute of Fashion Technology. I'm studying Masters of Design there, and we are mainly involved with design research. So I would like to take what's your take on the dissemination of information that we are talking about, that giving the information to the younger generation so that they would get to know what their culture was and all that. What is your take on the exclusivity of a particular community? That's their information, right? About their religion, why they are making a particular motif in a particular manner. It relates to their culture, their heritage. When we put that up on a interface for everybody to see, and something that is open source, obviously it makes people aware what is that culture about, but is it also encouraging to practice that same craft or art activity which has no context with, for example, a white person who would have no context or relation to the religion that the Aboriginal is following? So what is your take on that?
To clarify, do you mind that people could actually copy those materials?
Exactly.
Yeah,
like
okay.
I'm trying to focus on the intellectual property rights.
Okay, great. So, great question. One of the things that, well, as I said, all of the content that is public will be decided by Aboriginal communities who own that content. So there won't be anything that goes up that people don't want to be public. In terms of people copying motifs or ideas, that's always an issue. And anything that is public, yes, people could copy it. However, they couldn't download it without... The other thing about this content management system that we're working with is that every single asset in the archive will be licensed. So, and some of the licenses are cultural licenses and some of them are commercial licenses, and there's a range of licenses we'll be developing. So if anybody wants to download it, they actually have to deal directly with the Arts Centre, and it may be they have to buy it, or they may have to sign a license that is a cultural license that has specific parameters around it. But of course, people don't have to do that. They can take a drawing of an image they see. They could do that anyway. That is a risk. And in Australia, that has been a problem that we have been dealing with for a long time, in which this whole kind of ethical approach and the Art Centre's focus like we have really promoted only deal with it's best only to deal with art centres because they are Aboriginal owned and run, and they really sort of monitor and standardise pricing. Whereas, you know, lots of other people who want to profit from the success of the industry go in and like buy things really cheaply and sell them at highly inflated prices, you know, giving no returns to Aboriginal artists. And then other people take designs of artists and take them to China and make them to tea towels, and, you know, that still happens. So there's no way to stop it from happening, but we are trying to safeguard that.
Exactly. This is an ongoing dilemma with China and everything. Thank you.
I think while we blame China, we should blame all of us.
Yeah.
No, it's not China. China has nothing to do with it, actually. It's like it's Australians who take it over there.
We do have a national body called VisCopy, which is basically a body that it's set up as a not-for-profit, and its job is to police intellectual property infringement and to ensure that cultural licenses are purchased. And so there is someone who is a watchdog, but how much of it is actually...
I think that had a big impact. A lot of that stuff has lessened, but I don't think that it's stopped.
If there is somebody who wants to do something, there is nothing that can stop them. I'm afraid I have to draw this talk to a conclusion. It's 8:25 and they're going to throw us out. But it's been marvelous. And we would love it from Craft Revival Trust if we could get a methodology that we could post online, because it is truly a best practice. And I think while I'm sure there are a lot of people who are aware about it, we were completely unaware about it till I went onto your website and read about it in detail and was very impressed. So if we could have it as a methodology, as a case study, and if we could post it on, we would be delighted.
Yes, we will get there eventually. I've just got to get this repatriation first, but then yes, absolutely. And
Can I just extend an invitation to all of you as well? We're actually here for the Australian Cultural Festival, which is going on over the next 4 months, and Hamer is one of the managers from the Australian High Commission in New Delhi, and so I'm sure she can provide you with information, but our exhibition is opening on November the 1st at the Lalit Kala Academy next week. And that is once again a different way of seeing the Australian landscape and some of the regions that we've been discussing. And we are also showing some of the films that Monique's been talking about from the Canning Stock Route
and some of the
project as well, and some of the photographs. So please come along.
Opens next Thursday.
Invitations.
First next Thursday.
Yeah.
And when is it on till?
It's until the 11th. It opens on the 1st.
So I'll see it when I return.
Yeah.
Lovely, wonderful.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Wonderful. Well done. You're going to have your next 6 years chalked out for you. I'm surprised you're not terrified. At least when Monique went into it, she thought
Didn't know.
Okay, I'll do it. Take care.
And then it kept going. Yeah.
You're much braver.
I think what's interesting though about the Pilbara is whether we'll get roadblocks.
You people are talking about one